On the morning of August 23rd, 2023 in Madrid, Mateo woke up earlier than usual, even without an alarm. It wasn't insomnia, it was a premonition, a strange feeling that something extraordinary was about to happen. In the small apartment in the Chamberí neighborhood, the morning silence mingled with the aroma of fresh coffee brewed by his mother, who moved calmly around the kitchen. He dressed slowly, avoiding the mirror that reflected not only his still youthful features, but also the restlessness pulsing inside him. At 16, Mateo had always been a quiet student, almost invisible in the eyes of his teachers, but with a brilliant mind that revealed itself in every equation scribbled in his notebook. The city awoke around him, but he felt trapped in a routine that on that day was about to transform into something unexpected. As he descended the stairs with silent steps, the anticipation in the air seemed to hint that this day held more than just ordinary classes. Welcome to Family Lies. Before starting, please like and subscribe so we can continue creating stories like this. The high school where he studied, housed in an old brick building with tall windows, exuded an austere, traditional charm, its hallways echoing with voices and past stories. The math teacher, Professor Vasquez, was known for his stern and merciless demeanor, always demanding maximum discipline and punishing any deviation with sharp criticism. His eyes observed each student with an almost clinical coldness. But that day, as he fixed a penetrating gaze on Mateo, something different seemed to hang in the air. The classroom walls, decorated with posters and formulas, bore witness to the growing tension as the students prepared for a lesson they would never forget. Vasquez, in his always impeccable suit, began the class by presenting a complex math problem designed to humiliate anyone who dared challenge his authority. But the atmosphere in the room began to thicken with a mix of anxiety and expectation, as if fate were drawing an invisible line between the professor's arrogance and the hidden talent of a brilliant young mind. When Vasquez turned to the whiteboard, the room fell into an almost palpable silence. In a firm voice, he wrote out a system of coupled differential equations, something even the most diligent students wouldn't dare attempt. Mateo's fingers trembled slightly as he gripped his pen, not out of fear, but contained excitement. His heart raced as if it knew this was the moment he had been silently preparing for years. The scent of chalk, mixed with the faint perfume of flowers, drifting through the half-open windows, and every breath from his classmates seemed to echo in his chest. A few turned to him with curious glances, but no one dared compete for the challenge the professor had set. This was an invisible duel, and everyone knew that one way or another, the dynamics of the classroom would change forever. Vasquez looked up in an almost theatrical gesture and pointed at Mateo. "You there, boy? Show us you're not just another pretty face." The words cracked like a whip, and the silence grew even heavier. The professor's hands rested on the desk, tense as his eyes scanned every feature of the student's face, as if searching for a flaw to expose. A chill ran down Mateo's spine, and he felt the weight of every gaze upon him. For a moment he closed his eyes, remembering how, at 7 years old, he had solved problems that made adults frown. He took a deep breath, faced the board again, and with the same calm he had felt at home, began writing the solution step by step, each line drawn with near-mechanical precision. The pen glided across the board with impressive fluidity as the equations aligned methodically, revealing solutions that seemed like magic to his classmates' eyes. The ticking of the wall clock grew loud, marking each passing second, and Mateo's heartbeat seemed to sync with that relentless rhythm. Sweat became visible on Professor Vasquez's forehead, staining his suit collar. Some students exchanged incredulous glances, stifling whispers that died in their throats. The sunlight streaming through the windows reflected off the white chalk marks, giving the demonstration an almost supernatural glow. When Mateo finished, he took a step back and crossed his arms, his gaze steady, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. For a few moments, no one dared to breathe. The silence stretched beyond the bounds of time, and the only audible sound was the faint echo of the chalk being set down. Then Vasquez let out a deep sigh that sounded more like a contained roar. He lifted his head, looked at the meticulous work on the board, and in a hoarse voice murmured, "Impossible." His lips trembled, not with anger but with genuine astonishment, something no one had ever seen in this man before. A student at the back of the room raised his phone, pressed record, and a quiet click began documenting the moment. The air grew thick with adrenaline, and in that instant, it became clear that nothing would ever be the same again. The murmurs started almost immediately. Whispers grew into audible voices, questioning whether what they had witnessed was real or a collective hallucination. The phone passed from hand to hand, the video racking up views and reactions in the class group chat within minutes. The sound of notification alerts competed with the ticking clock, and Mateo felt his face grow warm under the stares, no longer curious but filled with admiration and awe. Adrenaline pulsed through his veins, and for a second he wished he could disappear, return to his usual anonymity. But it was too late. The talent he had hidden for so long had revealed itself before dozens of witnesses. During recess, as students discussed and shared the video, Vasquez retreated to his office with heavy footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Inside, he closed the door behind him and leaned against it, breathing heavily. Frustration mixed with shame as he rummaged through his pockets, pulling out a crumpled note with lesson reminders, a testament to his unchallenged authority. Outside, voices grew louder. "Did you see that? What that kid did was unbelievable." Mateo's name was already spreading like wildfire. Deep down, Vasquez knew this afternoon wouldn't end at school. Something much bigger had just begun. At 1:15 p.m., the bell rang for classes to resume, but the atmosphere had shifted. The hallway leading to Vasquez's classroom was filled with students whispering and pointing at screens displaying the video. When Mateo entered, he felt the floor steady beneath him, but the weight of every stare made him shudder. A few classmates clapped discreetly. Others simply watched in silence, as if waiting for an outcome. Vasquez stood by his desk, his expression hard, but his eyes betrayed unbearable tension. He cleared his throat, and for a moment, everything hung in suspense, as if the world had paused for the next act. In a firm yet restrained voice, Vasquez began the second part of the lesson. "Today, we won't have conventional exercises. I want everyone to learn from the example of excellence we just witnessed." He gestured to the board, where Mateo's notes still remained. The professor went over each step of the solution, explaining every detail in an almost reverent tone, as if confessing a secret he had always known but never admitted. As he spoke, some students scribbled notes, frantically, trying to understand not just the answer, but the thought process behind it. Mateo remained silent, seated at his desk, watching the surreal scene unfold, feeling a mix of quiet pride and deep discomfort. At the end of class, Vasquez faced the students and said, "I hope you learned something more than formulas today." He walked to Mateo's desk and with a slow gesture placed a small blue notebook on it, his personal journal, filled with notes on students' performances. "Maybe you should read this," he murmured before turning and leaving the room in absolute silence. The classmates watched curiously, but no one dared touch the notebook. To Mateo, it symbolized a broken barrier. The man who had always seen him as nothing now silently acknowledged the greatness of his mind. On the way home, Mateo's thoughts swirled with conflict. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on Madrid's streets, and every step echoed on the empty sidewalk. His phone buzzed in his pocket with notifications from unknown numbers, reporters, university professors, even institutions expressing interest. He hit decline, trying to focus on the road ahead. But inside, he felt a mix of fear and excitement. At 7, his mother had shielded him from the academic world, fearing the pressure would suffocate him. Now, that protection seemed impossible to maintain. At home, his mother immediately noticed Matteo's distant expression. She was brewing tea in the kitchen, the comforting scent of chamomile clashing with the storm raging in her son's mind. Without questions, she handed him a cup, and he accepted it silently. His fingers trembled as he held it, as if searching for an anchor amid the emotional whirlwind. She ran her hand through his hair, as she had when he was a child, and let silence fill the space. Within those familiar walls, the outside world seemed to shrink, but the pressure remained. Sitting at the kitchen table, mother and son talked about what had happened for the first time. In a calm voice, she asked how he felt, and he described the humiliation he had always carried behind his genius. He spoke of his fear of attention, his desire to just be another face in the crowd. She listened intently, recalling the years she had kept him away from competitions and awards, all so he could have a normal childhood. When Matteo mentioned the note Vasquez had left, her eyes filled with worry and pride. It was confirmation that, no matter how much she wanted to, she could no longer hide her son's talent. The next morning, Matteo woke to the insistent ringing of the landline. His mother answered, and the conversation was brief. He only caught the words, "European Institute of Mathematical Research," before she covered the receiver and stared at him in silence. When she hung up, she approached cautiously and said, "They want to talk to you. They're impressed." Matteo's stomach twisted. He didn't know if it was fear or excitement, but the mere idea of being recognized by one of the continent's most respected institutions made his head spin. Still in his pajamas, he sat on the couch and stared into space, trying to decide if this was the start of a dream or the end of the peace he knew. At school, the atmosphere had changed. Students who had barely noticed him before now greeted him in the halls, and even teachers treated him with subtle deference, as if he no longer belonged there. Yet Matteo still carried his worn-out backpack and walked timidly, avoiding the curious eyes that followed him. In the classroom, he found his desk surrounded by notes inviting him to math clubs, science fairs, and school interviews. He collected them one by one and shoved them to the bottom of his bag, as if trying to hide what was now impossible to deny. He was no longer invisible. During lunch, Matteo isolated himself on a bench at the back of the courtyard, under the shade of a tree only he seemed to notice. As he listlessly chewed the cheese sandwich his mother had packed, he caught fragments of nearby conversations. He solved it in under 2 minutes. Vasquez turned pale. "Do you think he'll leave school now?" He tried to tune them out, focusing on the branches swaying gently above him. For a moment, he wished it were all just a strange dream, that he'd open his eyes and be back in a boring algebra class, listening to the monotonous scrape of chalk on the board. In the afternoon class, Vasquez entered earlier than usual. His gaze swept the room cautiously, as if testing whether he still had control. The usual authoritarian tone was gone. His gestures were restrained, almost hesitant. He called Matteo to the board again, but this time with a different tone. "Would you mind explaining to the class how you thought through yesterday's solution?" It sounded more like a request than an order. Matteo hesitated for a few seconds but walked to the front. His hands were sweaty, but his voice was steady. As he explained, he noticed the professor listening with genuine attention, for the first time perhaps, seeing him as an equal. After class, Vasquez asked to speak with him privately. In the back of the room, with the blinds half open and the setting sun streaming in, the professor seemed like a different man. His voice was more human, less professorial. "Matteo, I need to admit, I underestimated you, and I was cruel. Maybe because I was never a brilliant student myself, and now I spend my days trying to maintain control that slips through my fingers." Matteo listened in silence, surprised by the confession. Part of him wanted to confront Vasquez, to say everything he had held back over the past 2 years. But there was something in the man's vulnerability that stopped him. It was as if he were finally seeing the person behind the mask of authority. On his way out, Matteo was met by 2 journalists waiting at the school gate. A woman with a microphone and a man with a handheld camera approached before he could react. "Are you Matteo Ortega? Can we ask you a few quick questions? How did it feel to solve that equation? Are you considering universities abroad?" He stepped back, visibly uncomfortable, and looked around for help. Then Beatrice, a classmate, appeared out of nowhere, grabbed his arm and said loudly, "He's not answering anything, he just wants to go home." Surprised, Matteo thanked her with a glance. In that moment, he realized that even as everything changed, maybe he wasn't completely alone. On the walk back, Beatrice walked beside him in silence for a few blocks. She was one of the few students who, even before the incident, had tried talking to Matteo a few times, always kindly. Near the corner bakery, she broke the silence. "You don't have to answer anything you don't want to, you know. They'll keep trying, but you can choose." He nodded, grateful but still confused. He had never handled attention well, especially now when everything was moving too fast. She smiled and said, "If you want to disappear for a few days, my grandfather has a countryside house 2 hours from here. No one will find you there." The offer sounded absurd, but strangely tempting. That night, Matteo couldn't sleep. His room was dark, but his mind raced. He thought about the university offers, the cameras, the professor's apology, the girl who now seemed to understand his turmoil. Everything felt out of order, as if his life had slipped through an invisible crack. At 3:27 a.m., he got out of bed and went to the balcony. The cool air brushed his face, bringing some relief. From above, the city seemed asleep, oblivious to the chaos inside him. For the first time, Matteo realized he might actually have a choice. Not about his talent, that was undeniable, but about what to do with it. The next morning, Matteo came down for coffee with heavy eyes, but a decision pounding in his chest. His mother was quietly preparing coffee, as she did every morning. But this time there was an envelope on the table with the seal. Of the University of Cambridge. She looked at him gently, without pressure. "It arrived this morning. It's real, son." He picked up the envelope carefully but didn't open it. Instead, he met her eyes and said, "Can I take a few days away, just to think?" She understood immediately. She knew her son was caught in something far bigger than he had ever wanted or expected. Without question, she simply said, "Go. Just call me when you get there." Matteo met Beatrice in front of the school, her backpack slung over her shoulder and her grandfather's truck keys in hand. "Are you serious about this?" he asked, still disbelieving. She laughed. "I think you need a break, and so do I." The trip was long and quiet. They passed through small towns, tree-lined roads, and old gas stations frozen in time. The radio played old Spanish songs, mixed with the sound of wind rushing through the open window. For much of the ride, they sat in comfortable silence. Neither knew exactly what they were doing, but both felt it was right. The countryside house was simple, with aged wooden walls and the scent of eucalyptus in the air. It stood on a hill surrounded by green fields and tall trees. There was no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, and for Matteo, that was almost a relief. Right after arriving, he collapsed onto an old sofa covered with a wool blanket and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe. Beatrice made hot tea and watched the view from the porch. When he joined her, they sat in silence, looking at the grey sky. "I think the world out there can wait," she said, and without thinking, he replied, "Yeah, for the first time I think so too." Over the next few days, Matteo allowed himself to live slowly. He walked through the fields, read old books left by Beatrice's grandfather, scribbled equations in notebooks just for fun. No pressure, no spotlight. At night, they cooked together and talked about everything except fame or math. It was there that he realized something. Away from others' expectations, he could hear himself. The silence of the countryside confronted him, but also healed him. Beatrice, with her direct manner and calm gaze, helped keep him grounded. By the end of the first week, he knew what he needed to do, not out of obligation, but because he was finally at peace enough to choose. On the way back, the world seemed louder. Just turning on his phone made notifications explode. Interview requests, academic offers, messages from strangers asking for advice or wanting to know the secret. Matteo turned it all off before reaching the gate. His mother was waiting in the living room, her expression a mix of worry and relief. "You look lighter," she said, hugging him tightly. He just replied, "It was good, necessary." That night, he sat with her at the table and told her everything. About Beatrice, about the days in the countryside, about how he felt when Vasquez apologized. She listened carefully and, at the end, simply said, "You don't owe anyone anything, Matteo, not even your talent." The next day, Matteo decided to respond to the offers, not with a yes, but with a thank you, but not now. He wrote short, polite emails. It wasn't a final rejection, just a conscious pause. Then he posted a simple note online. "I appreciate the kindness and opportunities, but right now I'm prioritizing my mental health and personal life. The talent exists, but it's only one part of me." The reaction was immediate. Support, criticism, speculation. But strangely, he wasn't shaken. He knew he had made the right choice. For the first time, he felt his life was under his control, not in the hands of a system that had tried to mold him since childhood. At school, the reception was odd. Some classmates treated him like a celebrity, others avoided him, as if faced with something they couldn't understand. Professor Vasquez, meanwhile, kept his distance. He avoided eye contact, no longer called on Matteo directly, and seemed to walk on eggshells. On a rainy morning after class, Matteo went to the teacher's lounge. He knocked and waited. When Vasquez saw him, his eyes widened as if expecting a confrontation. But Matteo just said, "I didn't come here for revenge. I just wanted you to know I don't hold a grudge." The professor nodded silently, with the air of someone still learning to handle his own fall. At the school gate, Beatrice was waiting, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. "Did it go okay in there?" she asked, handing him one. Matteo smiled. "I think so. At least I did what I needed to." They walked together to a small square nearby and sat on the farthest bench. "Are you going to keep attending classes like normal?" she asked. "For now, yes. I still like learning, just at my own pace, in my own way." She smiled with her eyes and clinked her cup against his. It was a simple, almost mundane moment, but full of meaning. Matteo finally felt he had found balance, and that, despite the recent chaos, his life could be his own. Again, routine gradually returned, but with a new awareness. Matteo woke early, went to school, helped his mother with chores, and studied on his own at night. Not to prove anything, but because he enjoyed it. He set up a board with mind maps and equations that intrigued him, no longer hidden but displayed in his room. When friends visited, they found it curious, but no one mocked him. He was no longer the invisible boy in the front row, and, interestingly, he was no longer the internet genius. He was just Matteo, a quiet, intelligent boy, now more sure of himself. His mother watched him with attentive but discreet eyes. She knew her son was still processing everything. Sometimes he withdrew into his own world, especially when memories of the public exposure resurfaced. But it wasn't suffering, it was growth. One night, seeing him solve a complex problem in his notebook, she remarked, "Remember that day you said you wanted to stop thinking?" Matteo smiled slightly. "I do, and I still think about it sometimes, but now I know I can choose what to think. That changes everything." She teared up. He was growing up, yes, but more than that, he was becoming someone who chose who he wanted to be. One day, Matteo received an unexpected letter. Not an email or a direct message, a physical letter with a stamped envelope and everything. The sender was a retired professor from the University of Tartu in Estonia. Inside was a short handwritten note. Intelligence that isn't free becomes a prison. You reminded me of that. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Matteo reread those words 5 times. There was no formal invitation, no grand proposal, just recognition and respect. He tucked the letter into his favorite drawer alongside his old notebooks. Maybe he'd never reply, or maybe he would, but knowing someone saw him as a person, not a spectacle, was enough. In the following months, the spotlight gradually shifted. The internet, as always, moved on, swapping idols and scandals. With ease, Matteo made peace with it. He was still remembered occasionally, of course. An article or two mentioned the boy from Bilbao, and old videos still circulated. But he was no longer defined by them. Beatriz remained by his side, steady and present. His mother more at ease, and Matteo more whole. If anyone asked what he wanted to be in the future, he still didn't know. But now that uncertainty didn't scare him. Instead, it was a blank space where he could write whatever he chose. On a sunny weekend, Matteo and Beatrice visited an old observatory on the outskirts of the city. The place was half abandoned but still open to the public. They climbed to the dome, where an old telescope pointed at the sky. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood and dust, with a faint metallic tinge. "Have you ever thought about studying physics?" she asked, fiddling with the telescope's controls. "I have, but I don't know. I'm still figuring out if I like the challenge or the beauty in it more." Beatrice smiled. "Maybe both." They stayed there a while, watching the clear blue sky and imagining what lay beyond what their eyes could see. On the way back, they spoke little. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't weigh you down. Matteo gazed out the bus window, watching trees rush by too fast, as if time were in a hurry. But inside him, everything was slow. This chapter of his life, which had begun with humiliation and shock, now felt like part of a larger cycle. There was no more anger, no urgency, just a kind of mature acceptance and the realization that he could live on his own terms without having to prove anything to anyone. The story of the school genius was just one chapter, and he still had many more to write. On Monday, returning to school, Matteo noticed a change in the teacher's gazes. No longer disdain or flattery, just a quiet respect. As if they had finally understood he didn't want to be a symbol of anything, just left in peace. Mr. Vasquez still taught, but differently. He stopped yelling, listened more. He even praised a shy student for a good answer, something he would never have done before. Maybe he still carried his arrogance, but he was trying. And, incredibly, that was also part of the change Matteo had sparked, unintentionally, but with impact. During recess, Matteo went to the library. He picked up a book on game theory, just out of curiosity. As he was leaving, a freshman girl approached. "You're Matteo, right? I just wanted to say, I like math too, but I'm too shy to talk about it." He smiled and replied, unhurried, "We don't have to talk to enjoy it. But if you ever need help, you can ask me." She thanked him quietly and left. That small, almost insignificant gesture filled Matteo with a strange feeling. Not pride, but connection. He was here, present, living something real, and that was worth more than any genius title. At home that night, Matteo sat at the kitchen table with his mother. They were eating bread with tomato and olive oil, a simple meal always made with care. She watched him silently for a while, then said, "You've changed, but in a good way." He laughed, a little embarrassed. "I think I just stopped being afraid of who I am." She nodded, emotional. "That's all I ever wanted for you." And in that moment, without grand speeches or decisions, Matteo understood that sometimes life doesn't need epic milestones, just small truths spoken at the right time. And this was one of them. Later, alone in his room, he opened the notebook where he kept his ideas and sketches. At the top of the page he wrote, "Choosing silence is also an answer." Beside it, he drew a system of equations he didn't fully understand yet, but wanted to explore. There was no pressure, no expectations, just curiosity. That night was calm. No new emails, no noisy notifications. Just him, his thoughts, and a strange, but welcome, sense of lightness. For the first time in a long while, Matteo slept deeply. No chaotic dreams, no hidden fears, just sleep and peace. The next morning, Matteo woke before his alarm. The sky was still dark, the house silent. He lay in bed for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cool breeze from the half-open window. He thought about everything that had happened over the past months, the embarrassment, the shock, the offers, the choices. But now, it all felt distant, as if it had happened to someone else. He got up slowly, made coffee, and sat on the couch with a blanket over his shoulders. For the first time, he felt no anxiety about the day ahead, just a kind of acceptance. Whatever came, he could handle it. At school, routine returned to normal. No one whispered when he walked by. The video still existed, of course, but it had lost its novelty. Matteo preferred it this way. He focused on his own projects, small mathematical explorations he did for himself, with no need to show anyone. Vasquez gave him space now. No more provocations, no more flattery. He was just another teacher, flawed, human, trying to improve. And Matteo, in turn, no longer resented him. Time had settled things, as if everything had found its place. Even the classroom, once tense, felt lighter. It was on an ordinary afternoon that Matteo made his final decision about his future. He was walking alone through the city park, listening to the crunch of dry leaves underfoot and watching children run around. He sat on a wooden bench and just breathed. He didn't want to go to Stanford, or Cambridge, or be on magazine covers. He wanted to study, yes, but at his own pace, in his own way. Maybe teach, maybe write. Maybe live a life without spotlights, where his talent was a tool, not a showcase. There, among trees and distant voices, he chose the less obvious path. When he got home, he told his mother, "I'm not accepting any of those scholarships now. Maybe later. But for now, I want to stay here. Take things slow." She studied him for a moment, worried, then smiled. "Matteo, if that's what will make you happy, then it's the right choice." He knew the world wouldn't forget him, that someday they might try to drag him back into the spotlight. But now he was ready. He knew how to say no. He knew his worth didn't depend on anyone's approval, and that was all he needed. In the months that followed, Matteo kept a quiet routine. He spent hours reading, jotting down loose ideas, solving problems no one asked him to solve. Sometimes he tutored younger classmates for free. He didn't want fame, just to make sense of the world in his own way. People still called him a genius now and then, but he learned to smile and let it go. It wasn't about that. It was about being whole, about using what he knew to build something, even if it was invisible to others. He discovered that freedom was also the power to choose what not to do, and that was enough. There was never another viral moment. The world, busy with new phenomena and distractions, moved on. But to those who truly knew him, Matteo became a different kind of legend, not for what he showed the world, but for what he chose to keep. The video was still out there, lost in some corner of the internet, with old comments and forgotten likes. But Matteo, he was at peace, and that, in the end, was the hardest equation he had ever solved.